Hello, everyone. We're lucky enough today to be joined by author E.L. Lyons, author of the Gifts of the Old Tree series, which starts with Starlight Jewel, one of my favourite reads of the year that I read it, and of which the sequel, Ostringer's Wrath, is coming out. Well, I'll let E.L. decide when it's coming out. She's
Soonish.
also yeah, she's also known for her Lyons Pen work, which is her blog where she talks about grammar, editing, and a bunch of other stuff that's super important to self-published authors, including things like how to do cover art on the fly for cheap. But today we're going to focus on grammar and editing, two of my biggest pitfalls personally, as I'm sure Yael knows, since I've learned more about writing dialogue tags from one or two conversations with her than any number of YouTube videos that I'd looked at. So we'll dive right into it and we'll start with the first question. So, what's the most common grammar and punctuation mistakes that you see authors make?
Dialogue tags and beats. So I think because we don't really learn these things in school because nobody is really making you write fiction in school, it's kind of a punctuation issue that just doesn't get noticed. But when you're indicating the speaker, you either use a tag or a beat, and people get the punctuation for those wrong consistently all the time. Even people who read all the time, for some reason, in edited books, we just don't notice how it's punctuated. But if it's a tag that's like she said, you have a comma before the quotation mark. And if you're indicating the speaker with an action, like she smiled, then you have a period. And so that's the biggest thing I see getting mixed up. And there's more dialogue grammar rules about, if you have multiple paragraphs from the same speaker, or if you have interruptions, whether it's a speaker interrupting or the speaker interrupting themselves with an action. Like if you have she sneezed, you're going to have dashes on either side if it's in between the sentence, but if there's two complete sentences, then it's a beat in the middle. Anyway, so that's the most common thing I see. The other most common thing I see is the mix-up of hyphens and dashes. So, and that's different between the US and the UK. Well, the hyphens are the same, but the dashes are different. The UK uses more in dashes for where we use M dashes, but they also use some M dashes for like dialogue interruptions. And so what I see people do basically is use hyphens for everything, um, which, it doesn't look very aesthetically pleasing for one, but it's also just incorrect. The thing on your keyboard is a hyphen. That is not a dash. And there are some programs that will automatically like fix it for you if you do like a double or a triple dash. Like
Mhm.
Word has like an algorithm for that, but it is imperfect. Sometimes it makes mistakes, especially if there's if it's an interruption with a quote next to it, then the algorithm doesn't get it right. Um, the third thing is the overuse of semicolons and commas. A lot of people just use semicolons when there's not two independent clauses and there's not a complex list. They just use it, I guess, because they want more than a comma, but it's not
Because
actually
they look
grammatically
cool.
correct. Yeah, they just feel
Because
like,
they're cool.
there's a gut feeling that, you should be using a semicolon there, but you shouldn't trust your gut with that. You should trust the grammar. And then commas, I see a lot of, walk-in commas, the for stylistic effect, but it isn't stylistically good. Sometimes it is, but you know just using a bunch of really dramatic commas all throughout, uh, and with no rhyme or reason to it, that's something else I see
Mhm.
a lot. So those are the three biggest things I see. And the first two are super easy to fix. If you learn those, like with your writing, I
Yeah.
think the last thing I looked at of yours, I didn't have to point out like anything because, that was your
Character.
biggest problem. Yeah, so if you get those things right, your writing is going to look a lot more professional really quickly. And I think anybody can learn those. They're not complicated. It's not like commas. I've tried to do posts on commas before, and there's so many comma rules that it's hard to make a Twitter post about it. My threads are
Yeah.
already long enough.
we'll move on to question two then, which I think this is something that I'm super guilty of, is some of the pitfalls that authors fall into when they edit their own work.
All right, so the biggest one that I think I see is overconfidence in your knowledge of grammar. I think most people who go to write a book were good at English in like grade school and loved English and read a lot, and they assume
Yeah.
that they know more than they do. And so they don't double check themselves, they don't double check the definitions of words.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the definition, especially of like idioms and terms and things, they just don't, they don't question whether or not they're right often enough. And I think if
Mm-hmm.
people had less confidence in themselves, which I know is weird to say to writers because we're always like really self-conscious about that,
Yeah.
but if we were less confident in how correct we were about word usage and grammar usage, editing would probably go more smoothly. The second thing is not letting the manuscript rest when you're that close to it. When you've just finished it, it's not the best time to edit because it is so fresh in your mind that your brain will fill in a lot more gaps than you have any idea. But if you let it rest and you forget a little bit, if you forget how you worded things, then you go back and you can spot a lot more errors and a lot more inconsistencies. And sometimes you run into things where you wonder, what was I even trying to say?
Mm-hmm.
Versus if you have just written it, you still know what you were trying to say. So you're not the best equipped to edit it then. Then getting too personally attached to the work.
Yeah.
This definitely hurts you, especially if you're getting feedback, and this is another good reason to let it rest. Get a little bit of personal distance from it. So then when you get that feedback from people or you go to edit it, you're not attached to what you've already done. And things don't feel like, an attack on you as a writer or you as a person when people try to give you that criticism and you can actually take it to heart and use it without getting upset about it. For a lot of beta readers who have been doing it for a while and editors, when we see those kind of reactions early on, you're gonna get ghosted really quick. When I see that somebody is sensitive, I'm just like, okay, this isn't where I'm meant to be.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I
I'm
feel
not
you.
the right person. I cannot, walk on eggshells. I just want to tell you how you can make this better. And, people are really there. I haven't really run into anybody who is trying to be mean when they're beta reading. It's something you do for free out of the kindness
Mhm.
of your heart. And so when beta readers get accused of being like cruel or mean, I think that's usually just people being a little sensitive.
Yeah.
Um, but
Which I get.
confuse Yeah, I mean, you pour your heart and soul into something and it feels like your child, but you can't be gentle parenting your books. So,
Yeah. Yeah. True. It also, I guess, robs the book of being the best that it could be.
yeah. And the best beta readers, it's not that all beta readers or all editors are good. The best beta readers are going to take what you've written and understand what you were trying to do and help it be more of that. They're gonna cut away the fat that takes away from what's really good about it, and they're going to help you add things that enrich it to make it the best thing that it can be, but still yours. Versus there are some, especially other authors who are beta readers who will attempt to make your story the way they would have written it, which is not like if somebody doesn't understand what you were trying to do or they don't like what you were trying to do, that's not the right person. And maybe they're the right person for somebody else's book, just not for yours.
It's a risk that you run, but I've said for a long time that one of the best things an author can do, especially an indie author or someone who's new or just making their debut, is to find other writers in the same genre who write similar kind of stuff or at least similar feeling stuff. Find out what their big pitfalls are, exchange manuscripts, help each other out with stuff. But it's good to have people you can rely on that will give you good feedback without tearing it to bits.
And, the same genre is a good point. I actually had
Mm-hmm.
a horror reader beta read one of my books, And that
Oh,
was
right.
that was he was confused, I was confused. Get people who are as close to your genre as humanly possible. And if you have a beta reader or a reader from outside your genre, take it with a grain of salt because a horror book is written completely different from even horror fantasy. Like
Mhm.
they're just different. That's a much more fast-paced thing than like epic fantasy.
Yeah.
But yeah. And another thing people do wrong is confuse habits with style. Um,
Mhm.
Especially debut authors, they think this is how I write, this is my style. Your debut should not be your style. Your style is something you find along the way. Your debut
Yeah.
is basically a series of learning experiences.
Hmm.
Like that first book you write is where you learn how to not make those same mistakes next time. Um,
Yeah.
you've got a lot of bad habits when you're first starting out, and a lot of things that are probably holding you back. That's not style. Style isn't like just how you naturally write. It's kind of like
Hmm.
that Australian breakdancer thing. That's what
Oh,
you look
yeah.
like when you say that. When you say this is my
Yeah.
style, that's what you look like, and that's not style. That's just you didn't learn how to do the things right.
It's that feels like a very personal issue. And the reason that I unpublished my first four books ever was because I went, this is my style, this is how I write. And how I wrote was no editing, don't know how to do dialogue properly, no spell check, no chapter breaks, nothing, quarter of a
Oh,
million words,
yeah.
nonsense. And then, like you said, letting the book rest, you go back to it years later and like, God, this is garbage. I haven't let anyone else read this. This is terrible. But at the time, it was the best thing I'd ever written, you know?
Yeah, I mean, everything new you write should be the best thing you've ever written. You should be improving. Your style should not be, if your style is holding you back, then that's always an issue. But if you can look back and say, man, that thing I wrote last year was crap, then that's a good sign. And sometimes it's so crap that you got to unpublish it. Not saying that's true. I haven't read those unpublished books, but since you
Yep.
mentioned no chapter breaks, I feel like you probably had some problems.
And you would be able to tell it was mine. You'd see a lot of the same, like you said, habits versus style that I've
hmm
since ironed out into deliberate decisions. But they weren't deliberate when I made them
Exactly.
first.
Yeah,
So
yeah. You take some of your mistakes and you can turn those mistakes from your early writing into something better and
yeah,
something that actually is your style. But and people hear a lot of advice about, you don't always need correct grammar and things like that, and they take that wrong. You don't, but you've got to be intentional about it, and you do have to be making
yeah.
those deliberate decisions.
Or as I'm
But
fond of telling people who don't feel the need for grammar and proper punctuation and everything, like Cormac McCarthy can get away with it,
mhm.
in the road or something, because he's doing it deliberately. I always thought, have you read the road?
No, I've heard a lot about it because of grammar. Everybody always brings it up, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, the grammar and stuff is interesting because it's non-existent. But I think, given that it's post-apocalypse and society's collapsed, the rules are gone, including the rules of grammar, spelling, etc. So it gives it a
Yeah,
really kind of. I always thought that was deliberate.
a
But
very
speaking of,
close third POV sort of
yeah, yeah,
technique. Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
it's fun when it's intentional, and like anybody who's read my Yes and Nomad short story knows that I love incorrect grammar if you
yeah.
use it correctly. I love
But
incorrect grammar used correctly. But
yeah, given that you're quite good at grammar, I think it's fair to say you have to know the rules very well to break them in a convincingly good way.
yeah, it definitely helps to know that you're even breaking a rule. Like I think there's like this misunderstanding that you just don't have to learn them, and that's what people mean when they say you can use incorrect grammar. No, you still have to learn them, but you have to learn it and then break the rules in a way that actually makes sense for what's going on.
Cool. So let's go on to question three then, which is about dialogue specifically. So anything from how dialogue comes off, how it sounds, rhythm, pacing, etc., but also just the punctuation of how to properly write dialogue. I imagine you've seen a lot of this.
Yeah. So Um, the biggest, like, as far as content goes, is what I call the anyone, anywhere dialogue.
Hmm.
So it feels like it's sitting on the surface of the story because the characters are just talking, and it could be anyone talking anywhere, like, and not specific to your world, to the scene, to these characters. And you can really get taken out of the story with that kind of a dialogue, especially if it's early on in the book in those first
Hmm.
chapters when you're trying to get to know the characters, how people talk and what they talk about um, is really important early on to help readers connect with the character. And if they don't connect with the character, they're going to leave the book. Um, but so you've got a bunch of different layers to the story. You've got the world and you've got the setting and you've got the characters and you've got the plot. And if you tie those things into the dialogue, it can make it feel a lot more authentic. So your characters should be referencing the places and objects around them, and they should be, talking in their own unique voice. Is this character sassy? Are they really serious? Are they really formal, informal? There's all sorts of things, and I always recommend making like a character sheets, even for your side characters, and talking about how they communicate with others, what their issues are. Do they like metaphors or are they really academic? And having that, and then going back after you've written the original dialogue and seeing, does this really fit this character? And does it feel like they're actually talking in this place and in this world? Are the idioms and metaphors they're using relevant to the world around them? And that can really, change, make or break a story. And I
Hmm.
did actually take some screenshots for examples
Thanks,
for
Becky.
this one. So the Lies of Locke Lamora, which everybody loves.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Um, but if you look at this passage,
Mhm.
you can see that she's talking about his clothes, and then there's like commentary that relates specifically to their world and their situations. And, it brings the scene to life as opposed to her just flirting with him. She's not just flirting. She's, using everything around her, using the climate of the area. They're talking about the weather and his clothes and things like that bring it in. The other big issue in dialogue um, is that green authors tend to think they need to kind of plot dialogue as if it's its own little mini story, like start at the beginning of a conversation and then there's like a middle of the conversation and the end of the conversation. And that can work sometimes, but oftentimes it leads to a lot of unnecessary preamble, and that's not really how conversations work in real life. Conversations in real life, sometimes you'll be talking about things for 2 hours, but you're not even really talking for an hour of that. So you can't really do that in a book. But
Mhm.
you can start in the middle of the conversation. You'll see in popular books, some conversations and dialogues start with an ellipses, and it just starts in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a conversation that they were already having before the reader was there. And that's
Mhm.
a great way to skip over a lot of the hello, how are you? I've been,
Mhm.
meaning to like talk to you, that kind of feels really stiff and really awkward and unnatural in your writing. So don't be afraid to start a scene or a dialogue in the middle or even at the end. Like, you can start it with, so that's what happened when we were on the boat. And then you
Yeah.
can like assume that you have, instead of having to actually summarize everything that the reader just read in the last chapter, which is really annoying, you can start at the end of that conversation and then the reader will know, okay, this character is now updated. So you don't
Yeah.
actually have to write about it 5 times to update the entire character cast.
I feel like that's one I see all the time as well. Uh, and it ties into something that I really wanted to cover with you. There's loads of little turns of phrase that you'll come up with that I think have been ingrained into my own brain. And one of them is, as you know, Bob.
Oh, I think that was Vivian who came up with
Oh,
that one.
was it? Well, it was you that I saw say it, so I'll give the credit to Vivian. But
Yeah,
tell me a
I
little bit
do say
about
it a
as
lot.
you know, Bob. Yeah, it's good. It's a good way to
Mhm.
remember it. But what is as you know, Bob dialogue?
So as you know, Bob dialogue is like kind of that same sort of redundant, like you don't, the the reader never wants to read this dialogue, and it's where the character is summarizing events to another character, but this is like a more specific one where that character would already know. They've been on
Hmm.
this boat for 6 months together, and they're just now, for some reason, talking about like the mission that they're on. And so he's like, as you know, Bob, we're about to attack the marina. And, nobody, it sounds so forced, and it's clear to the reader that you're talking to them and not actually talking to the character. And
Yeah.
that just is a completely unimmersive experience. It's not fun. And it's very common in first chapters because you need to get information to the reader, and that seems like a good and efficient way. It's not. There is
Yeah.
always a better way.
Oh yeah. And then to round off dialogue, because I'm sure there'll be loads of questions about dialogue. When people are writing the dialogue tags, is there anything wrong with them using, Steve said or said Steve all the time? Because I read a lot of ones where it's obvious that the author is trying not to use the word said in the
Yeah.
dialogue tags.
Some people say said is invisible, and a lot of people
Mhm.
disagree with that. I'm one of the ones who disagrees. I think it's really weird and awkward when you have somebody asking a question and then saying, Steve said after, when Steve really asked, he didn't say. It's like
Ah, right, yeah.
it's the wrong tack. Um, but also I've seen people try to avoid repeating said like it's the plague. There's one book where I think I counted 40 something different tags, dialogue tags in the first chapter and prologue, and it
Mhm.
was wild. It was wild and it was not good. Um,
Seems
you
kind of fun trying to come up with that many, but you'd run out quick.
know, yeah, no, he's very creative. But it really takes you really shouldn't notice the tags. Like you want to make them as unnoticeable as possible. And when you come up with kind of these ridiculous things all the time, or it's really weird when somebody is always growling things or always whispering things. You know,
Yeah.
so said is the best one to use almost all the time. But, you really should be utilizing beats more. And this is advice I give to myself and I don't take as much. But beats are going to add more to the setting of your story and make your characters feel more like they're in the scene. And you don't need a beat and a tag. I also see that all the time. It'll be like, she said as she smiled. And that's just a waste of space. If she's gonna smile, just have her smile, and that's the beat, and that indicates who the speaker is, as long as that dialogue and that sentence are in the same paragraph, then
Hmm.
that's how that works. But yeah, you should be using beats more. So you're really, if you're doing things right, you're not gonna be saying said as much anyway. You're gonna be sprinkling in saids with beats instead of tags.
Yep. I still have engraved into the inside of my skull from when you read, I think it was Icebreaker, beat not a tag, beat not a tag.
Beat not tag, beat
Here
not
to
tag.
use a tag to the point that you just said, I'm just going to put a little mark here and it means beat not a tag. But yeah, I think my own writing has gotten much better after getting rid of this idea of beats within tags. And it's something that I didn't even know was really a thing until you brought it up. And I thought, oh yeah, it sounds much better if you stop using verbs like that. Stop using dialogue tags like that.
Something that nobody notices when you're reading a professionally edited book, you don't really see the deliberation behind the choices that were made and that they're doing certain things. Like everybody notices the popular quotes. Everybody
Mhm.
notices those profound dialogue things that people say, but they don't notice the functional things that keep this story moving at a fast pace.
So we'll start rounding everything out. Interesting question. If you think, in your experience, that the gap in editing quality between traditionally published things and indie published books, self published books, do you think that's changing or has changed?
I do think it's changing. So I think it was Tim McKay who said recently, He was kind of poking fun at people who are like, well, trad books have errors too. And it's usually like somebody will find one or two errors in a trad book and then compare that to indie books with like 500. Um,
Yep.
and it's a completely different ball game. But every book is going to have errors. MK Baker just found two in my arc, two typos.
Yep.
And professional editors are held to the standard of 95% indisputable errors. That's the acceptable error rate for any editor. Um, and with TradPub, I do think they're still mostly staying within that range that has always been the standard. And indisputable errors are different than a comma that's questionable. Uh, so it's really not that bad in TradPub, but the editing is getting worse. You can see that they're coming down and we're coming up with the editing. But in indie publishing, it's really hard to find an editor who's competent, and it's hard to know if your editor is competent if you don't know anything about grammar yourself. Because you can go by word of mouth and trust the other 10 indie authors who use them. They also don't know about grammar. So they think it's, a five-star editor and they've loved that editor. They don't realize that there's still like 20% of errors in their book. Um, so they, you really can't trust anything except learning the content yourself. And then an editor is still useful even if you know everything yourself because they're going to see things that you can't see. Like having that distance from the work is so useful. Uh, so it is bridging the gap, especially since we can hire any editor, and some people do hire great editors like Tim McKay and Sarah Chorn.
Mhm.
And Dominic Henkel does proofreading. Those people are all great, and but I see a lot of bad indie editors, and I've had to re-edit books for authors who have already paid for professional editing, and it sucks when you pay like $3,000 and they don't fix your beat tag punctuation. So
Oh,
it's I've encountered a few who like really don't know what they're doing at all, and the thing is, they're not malicious usually. Like they're just people who think they like that overconfidence issue. They think because they taught high school English for 20 years that they know, even though they've never picked up CMOS, they don't know the difference between formal and informal English. They don't know the rules that are really only applicable to fiction, like dialogue punctuation. And they just don't know what they don't know. But the thing is, they don't know too much to be like able to do fiction editing, and they shouldn't be. And they should be Googling first, what do I need to do to be a fiction editor? At the very least, you need to read, your region's style book, whether you're in the US, you need Chicago Manual of Style, and if you're in the UK, then the New Hearts, um, or Cambridge. But and then the Australians and Canadians are doing their own thing. I really don't. I don't have any answers for them. Um, Tim McKay, I think, is Canadian, but he's learned US and UK style conventions so that he can do both. And Canada and Australia both just pick and choose what they want. So, no.
they can do their own thing. We'll finish off because we've only got a wee 5, 6 minutes left in the call anyway. We'll finish off then with how should an author go about telling the difference between a good editor and a bad editor when they're looking for one? Is there any kind of test that they can give them? These are questions they could ask.
Like I said, learning the grammar yourself is definitely the best
Mhm.
thing you can do because then you can see what they don't fix. And the first thing you should ask is if they do US or UK style
Mhm.
English. It's better to find somebody who, natively speaks and reads that style English, but some
Mhm.
people know both. If, you know, they're not somebody who is actually from your region, then they're probably not going to know everything because there is a lot more differences than you think. It's not just gray in color. There's tons of words that are spelled different, and there's noun and verb agreement differences. There's a lot of things that you don't think about that are different in the US and UK. So if they don't actually know, it's safer to go with the person from your region. Also, ask what style book they adhere to for editing. And this is a good follow-up question for the US, UK, because if they say, oh, I don't use a style book, okay, then you should say no. Um, or, if they told you that they do US editing, but they use, APA or MLA or something that doesn't make sense for fiction. So if you're in the US, they should not
Yeah.
be using anything but CMOS. Um, and they can also reference New Hearts or the Cambridge Grammar if that's what they're using as a resource. It's not really a style book. There's the Cambridge Grammar style book, and then there's the Cambridge Grammar of the English Language reference book. Those are two different things. So
Mhm.
if they mention those other things, that's good. But if they're saying they're using US style, they should be saying CMOS. If they're saying they're using UK style, they should be saying they're using New Hearts or Cambridge. Um, so make sure that those two answers align and make sense, and
Uh-huh.
that they actually know what a style book is. Because I've met
Yeah.
editors who don't even know that they should be using a style book. They think that style books are just for academic writing, or they're
Uh-huh.
using the academic writing style book that they used in college for their, journalism degree for fiction. You can't do that. That's not how it works. Um,
Yep. That's cool.
so
That's cool.
and then always ask for a sample. And then ask for a sample from a few different people so that you can compare them. It's not going to help you if you only have one. How do you know how good that person is or how good of a
Mhm.
fit that person is compared to somebody else? And put in a few mistakes, especially if you know what kind of mistakes you make. Like I know
Mm.
I make a lot of homophone mistakes. If I was gonna hire an editor, I would add in a couple homophone mistakes so I could see if they catch it because there's knowledge and then there's also like, people's observation skills, which I don't think they can help, but you don't want an editor who just doesn't notice things,
Mhm.
who doesn't notice if you're using a phrase wrong or using the wrong, deep-seated versus deep-seated,
Oh,
spelling,
yeah.
or the toe the line and toe the line, you know. So you want somebody who's going to notice those little things, and you also want someone to compare them to. So get multiple, even if you're looking at one that's out of your price range and in your price range, and you
Mhm.
know this is the only person you can hire, still get somebody else so you can see what you're paying for and if it's even worth it. So,
Good
yeah.
advice. That's a bunch of stuff that I didn't know anything about. So it's turned out to be a very good learning experience anyway. So we've got 2 minutes left. Tell us where people can find more advice about editing and grammar and stuff from you. I know we've got Lyons Pen. We'll drop any
Uh,
links down in the description for the videos, obviously.
I've got my Instagram, which I don't post to very often, but maybe like once a week I'll make a reel that's really short. If you've got a really short attention span, I do talk about some things on there. Um, and I usually don't, I'm not able to go into detail, but if you do nothing else, you can at least watch those. And most of my grammar stuff is on Twitter, just because that's
Mhm.
easiest for me. So I'll write like a 20 thread tweet in a lot of detail when I should write an article. Um, so Twitter, I have like a grammar community, and I think Bob is the one who hosts that. So anyway, you can find the grammar community on Twitter, and then on my Substack, I'll occasionally do like a really big article on a grammar issue, especially a complicated one. Like there's a couple on dialogue there. So yeah.
Perfect. Well, we'll send people over there. Thanks very much for joining us, El. This has been really great learning experience. I'm sure we'll get loads of good stuff out of this, and maybe we'll do it again sometime with a different topic.
There's infinite grammar topics, so I'd love to be back on.
Yeah, we'll never run out. Excellent. Well, that's us, and we'll sign off for the day.